2 dog tags. Pressed tin, stamped with a name, a service number, a religion. Standard British military issue. The kind of object a family keeps in a drawer for decades without quite knowing what to do with it, because throwing it away feels like an erasure and keeping it feels like a wound that stays open. These particular tags came home without the man who wore them. He had been captured at Singapore in February 1942 and was dead by October. The cause of death listed on the Japanese camp records, when those records were eventually found and translated, was beriberi, which was technically accurate in the way that saying a man drowned is technically accurate when what happened is that someone held him underwater. He was 23 years old. He had been a prisoner for 8 months. The dog tags in the drawer. The specific, irreducible fact of them, the name, the number, the stamped religion that nobody asked him about before they let him die, represent a category of object that wars produce in vast quantities and that families keep for reasons that resist explanation. Not as relics of heroism, as evidence of loss, as proof that a specific person existed and was taken somewhere and did not come back. The tags are there because the body could not be sent home, because the grave was in soil thousands of miles away that Britain would not control again until the war was over, because the mechanism for returning the dead to their families simply did not function in this theatre the way it had in previous wars. The tags are what came instead. The British soldiers who came to understand, in the years that followed, what had happened to men like him did not stop taking Japanese prisoners because they had been ordered to. They did not stop because of a policy directive issued from above, or because their commanding officer had told them to. They stopped, when they stopped, because of something considerably more direct than policy. They stopped because they had seen what surrender meant in this particular war from the other side of the wire, and the calculation they were performing on a jungle track in Burma in 1944 was a different calculation than any soldier had been required to make on the Western Front or in the deserts of North Africa. This account is about what produced that calculation, the specific, documented, named reality of what British soldiers in Japanese captivity endured, the specific, documented conditions that British servicemen endured as prisoners of Japan. And the question it ends up asking is one that military history usually avoids, because the answer makes people uncomfortable. When you know exactly what your enemy is doing to prisoners, can you be entirely surprised that some soldiers stop wanting to make any? Has anyone in your family talked about the Far East War? Not the European War, the other one. The one that barely appeared in the British press because the correspondents were all in Normandy. If your grandfather or great-uncle served with the 14th Army or came home from a Japanese camp and said anything specific about what it was like, I want to hear it. That testimony is disappearing, and it deserves to be kept. To understand what happened in the jungles of Burma in 1944 and 1945, you have to start in a city that fell in a single day. Singapore was supposed to be impregnable. That word was used, explicitly, by people who occupied positions that should have required them to know better, and who had access to the intelligence assessments and military evaluations that would have told them it was not, if they had read those assessments carefully and acted on them in time. The great naval base, the guns pointing out to sea, the fortress island at the tip of the Malay Peninsula. Britain had spent decades building this position and decades more treating it as a fact of imperial life rather than a military problem that required continued attention. The assumption was that any attack would come from the sea. The sea-facing defences were formidable. The landward side, through what British maps described as impassable jungle, was considerably less so. The Japanese came down through the Malay Peninsula on bicycles. This detail appears in enough accounts to have become almost a cliché, but it deserves its place in the record because it captures something true about the nature of what happened. The Japanese soldier was trained to move through jungle on foot, carrying minimal equipment, living off what the terrain provided. The British soldier was equipped and trained for a kind of warfare that required roads, vehicles, supply lines, and the administrative infrastructure that conventional European armies had developed over centuries. In the Malay jungle, those were disadvantages. The Japanese came from the north, the guns pointed south. On the 15th of February 1942, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered. 85,000 British, Indian and Australian troops became prisoners of the Japanese Imperial Army in a single afternoon. It was, Churchill wrote, the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. He was right. It was also, though he did not say this, the beginning of something that the men who lived through it would spend the rest of their lives struggling to describe. The Japanese military philosophy regarding surrender was explicit and old. The Bushido Code held that a soldier who allowed himself to be captured rather than die fighting had dishonored himself, his family, and his emperor. This belief was not merely theoretical. It shaped how Japanese soldiers behaved in combat, where prisoners were extraordinarily rare, and it shaped how Japanese soldiers treated men who had surrendered, because those men had already, in the eyes of their captors, done the most shameful thing a soldier could do. Japan had signed the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, which contained provisions for the humane treatment of prisoners. Japan had not ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War, a fact that the Japanese foreign minister in 1943 made explicit when he stated publicly that Japan's army maintained the position that Japanese prisoners of war do not exist, a statement that tells you precisely how the Japanese military had resolved the question of whether its soldiers could ever be in that category. In practice, whether Japan had ratified the convention or not made very little difference to what happened inside the camps, because the Japanese military's attitude toward Allied prisoners was not primarily a legal question. It was a cultural one, and the culture in question had no framework for treating a surrendered enemy with respect, because the concept of a soldier who had surrendered and retained any kind of honor did not exist within it. Over 27% of British and Commonwealth prisoners of the Japanese died in captivity. The equivalent figure for prisoners held by Germany was around 4%, 7 times the death rate. In the same war. That number is not abstract. It is the product of specific conditions, specific decisions, and specific acts. And understanding those conditions is the necessary precondition for understanding why British soldiers in Burma, by 1944, had developed an attitude toward taking prisoners that their officers described variously as understandable, troubling, and impossible to entirely condemn. The contrast with the European theatre was stark and documented. British and Commonwealth prisoners in German hands faced serious hardship, food shortages, forced labour in some cases, mistreatment by individual guards, and in the case of Soviet prisoners, conditions that were catastrophically lethal. But the framework of the Geneva Convention, however imperfectly applied, provided a floor below which Western Allied prisoners in German camps generally did not fall. The Red Cross visited. Parcels were delivered, intermittently. Men were registered as prisoners, their families were informed. The death rate, though not negligible, was a fraction of what was happening in the Far East. The men of the 14th Army knew this comparison. They knew it because some of them had served in both theatres, and those who had not had been told about the difference by men who had. Briefings to new arrivals in Burma included information about the treatment of prisoners that served a dual purpose: to communicate what would happen if captured, which was designed to focus the mind on not being captured, and to convey what had happened to those who had already been captured, which produced an emotional and cognitive context for everything that followed. The knowledge that the war they were fighting operated by different rules, that the calculus of capture was fundamentally different here, was not an abstraction. It was a working assumption embedded in how they approached every engagement. It shaped how they read situations, how they assessed risk, and in some cases, how they responded to the specific moments when those situations resolved themselves in particular ways. The most documented single expression of what captivity under Japan meant is a railway. 415 kilometers of track through the mountains and jungle between Bangkok in Thailand and Rangoon in Burma, built between 1942 and 1943 using Allied prisoner labor and Asian civilian workers. The Japanese needed this railway. Their sea routes around the Malay Peninsula were under increasing threat from Allied submarines and aircraft as the war progressed. An overland supply line to Burma was a strategic necessity, a way of getting men and materiel to the front without exposing them to the increasingly effective Allied naval interdiction that was strangling Japanese logistics across the Pacific. The engineering estimate for the construction of a railway through that terrain, produced by British colonial surveyors before the war, had concluded that it would take 5 years under normal construction conditions. The Japanese built it in 16 months. The discrepancy between those two figures is a measure of what the difference between normal conditions and the conditions that actually prevailed on the construction site actually meant. 60,000 British, Commonwealth and Dutch prisoners worked on the railway. Of those 60,000, 16,000 died. The civilian labourers, known as Ramusha, drawn from Malaya, Burma and the Netherlands East Indies, suffered even worse. Of the approximately 270,000 who worked on the railway, over 100,000 died. Their deaths are less documented and less remembered, which tells you something about whose suffering the post-war record found easier to account for. The conditions on the railway were not the result of a policy designed to kill prisoners. They were the result of something that, in its own way, was almost more disturbing: indifference. The Railway Corps of Engineers, which ran the construction, was not responsible for feeding or providing medical care to the workers. That was the responsibility of the camp administration, a separate part of the military bureaucracy. The two bodies did not coordinate. There are documented cases in which medical supplies were available, but the Railway Corps refused to allow their distribution, noting simply, "No medicine for prisoners." Men died of cholera, dysentery, malaria, beriberi, and tropical ulcers. The last of these a specific horror of the jungle work: open wounds that spread from insect bites and bamboo scratches left untreated until they consumed whole limbs. They died of injuries that received no treatment because there was no treatment to give, or because what was available was withheld. They died of exhaustion, working 12 and 14-hour days on rations that would not sustain a sedentary adult, let alone a man performing hard physical labor in temperatures above 30 degrees with humidity to match. They died of beatings, administered for infractions so minor, a failure to bow quickly enough to a guard, a moment of hesitation in following an instruction given in a language the prisoner did not speak, that the punishment bore no relationship to any recognizable standard of proportionality. John Booth, a British prisoner on the railway, developed tropical ulcers on both legs so severe that he was given 5 minutes to decide between amputation and being left to die. He chose amputation. 4 fellow prisoners held him down, while a prisoner doctor amputated both legs using a saw, without anaesthetic. Booth survived. Most men who underwent amputation in those conditions did not. Captain Ernest Weary Dunlop, an Australian army doctor, kept a diary throughout his captivity on the railway. He recorded, with the precision of a medical professional, what he was seeing around him. His entries from the worst period, the so-called Speedo, when the railway construction was accelerated to meet its deadline, describe conditions so far outside normal human experience that reading them requires a particular kind of sustained attention to stay with what is actually being said. The railway was completed in October 1943. A Japanese military band played at the completion ceremony. The prisoners who had survived were told the work was finished. What followed was not relief, but a slow continuation of the same starvation and disease, now without even the grim purpose of the construction to organize the days around. The British prisoners who came home from the death railway were not, in the main, men who talked easily about what they had seen. Their health was comprehensively damaged: tropical diseases, malnutrition, injuries untreated for years, the specific sequelae of cholera and dysentery that weakened men for decades afterward. Their psychological state was something the 1940s lacked both the vocabulary and the institutional framework to address. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not a diagnostic category that the military medical system applied to Far East veterans. They were told they were home, which was true. They were not told, because nobody knew how to say it, that the effects of what they had experienced would follow them for the rest of their lives, which was also true. Major Basil Peacock, captured at Singapore and put to work on the railway, described conditions in the Chung Kai camp in Thailand in early 1944. Of 9,712 prisoners in the camp, approximately 2,500 were desperately ill, and a further 5,000 were sick or convalescing. The main killer, he wrote, was cholera. The other diseases, dysentery, malaria, beriberi, jungle ulcers, hookworm, formed a list that reads like a textbook of everything the human body is vulnerable to when it is simultaneously starved, overworked, and denied medical care. By the time British and Commonwealth soldiers advancing through Burma in 1944 and 1945 began to find evidence of what had happened in the camps, in liberated prisoners, in recovered documents, in the physical condition of men who walked out of the jungle, the death railway had already become a kind of shorthand for a category of treatment that the British military had no previous reference point for. Singapore itself produced its own specific version of this experience. Changi, on the eastern tip of the island, had been a British military base before the fall. The Japanese converted it into a prisoner of war camp after February 42. At its peak, Changi held roughly 50,000 men in facilities built for a fraction of that number. The conditions at Changi were not the worst that British prisoners of Japan endured. That distinction belongs to the railway camps, to Sandakan, to the hell ships. But Changi was the filter through which most of the Singapore prisoners passed, and what happened there in the first months shaped everything that followed. The Selarang Barracks Square incident occurred in August 1942. The Japanese ordered all prisoners to sign a form stating they would not attempt to escape. This was contrary to the Geneva Convention, which British prisoners understood themselves to be protected by, and which their officers refused to accept. In response, the Japanese moved approximately 17,000 prisoners, the entire population of several camps, into the Selarang Barracks Square, designed to hold perhaps 1,000 men. They provided no sanitation, no additional food, and no shelter beyond what the men carried. The temperature was over 30 degrees. Dysentery spread almost immediately. After 4 days, with men dying from the conditions, the senior British officer, Lieutenant Colonel E.B. Holmes, ordered the prisoners to sign the form. He did so because the alternative was watching men die from the consequences of a principled refusal, which was a calculus that the Japanese had clearly understood when they devised the punishment. The Japanese subsequently used the signed forms as evidence that prisoners had voluntarily agreed to remain in captivity. The legal reasoning was elegant, if you find that sort of thing elegant. The men who signed had no choice in any meaningful sense of the word. That distinction between formal voluntariness and actual coercion would have been familiar to any lawyer. The Japanese military was not administering a legal system. From Changi, men were dispersed to work parties across Southeast Asia, to the railway, to Burma, to labor camps in Japan itself, where prisoners worked in mines, shipyards and factories under conditions that civilian Japanese workers in the same facilities sometimes found disturbing enough to raise with their supervisors, observations that produced no improvement in the prisoners' treatment, but which survive in post-war testimony as a small record of the fact that what was happening was not invisible to those around it. To the hell ships, merchant vessels carrying prisoners between Japanese-controlled territories that were also legitimate military targets for Allied submarines and aircraft, which did not know men were aboard. The prisoners were packed into holds in conditions comparable to the worst episodes of the Atlantic slave trade, with minimal ventilation, inadequate food and water, and no ability to signal their presence to the Allied forces whose weapons were aimed at the vessels above their heads. Over 20,000 Allied prisoners died when hell ships were sunk, often by Allied torpedoes, in attacks that were militarily legitimate and operationally tragic. In at least one documented case, after a ship was sunk, Japanese rescue vessels collected Japanese survivors from the water and left Allied prisoners to drown. The official Japanese position afterward was that the ship had been carrying military cargo, not prisoners, a description that was both technically incomplete and morally evasive, in a way that the families of the men who died on those ships have never entirely forgiven. Of all the documented episodes of the treatment of British and Commonwealth prisoners of Japan, Sandakan is perhaps the most difficult to read through without stopping. In 1942 and 43, approximately 2,700 Australian and British prisoners, captured at Singapore, were transported to Sandakan in North Borneo and put to work constructing a military airfield. The initial conditions, by the standards of the other camps, were described by some survivors as relatively tolerable. This calibration tells you something about what the baseline was. The construction was completed under conditions consistent with the rest of the Japanese prisoner system: forced labor, inadequate food, beatings for minor infractions, no access to medicine beyond what prisoners improvised from local plants and materials. In August 1943, the Japanese discovered that prisoners had organized a covert radio receiver and were in contact with a local resistance network. The Kempei Tai, the Japanese military police, responded with arrests, torture, and transfers. The camp's remaining prisoners lost the officers who had been providing what organizational structure and morale support the situation allowed. Conditions deteriorated sharply from that point. By early 1945, with Allied forces advancing and Allied air power increasingly dominant, the Japanese decided to abandon Sandakan and move the surviving prisoners inland to a town called Ranao, 260 kilometers through jungle, swamp, and mountains. The prisoners who made this march, already malnourished, already ill, already depleted by 3 years of captivity, were given food sufficient for 4 days of a 9-day journey. Those who fell were killed. Those who survived the march arrived at Ranao to find the prisoners from the previous march mostly already dead. Of 2,700 men who had arrived at Sandakan, 6 survived. All 6 were Australians. All 6 had escaped into the jungle and been sheltered by local people who risked their own lives to hide them. The 6 British soldiers who had been at Sandakan were among the hundreds who died there, or on the march, or at Ranao. Their names are recorded. Their stories, reconstructed from the testimony of the survivors and from the records the Japanese left behind, are documented in war crimes trial proceedings conducted at Labuan in 1946. 6 survivors out of 2,700. The number is so extreme that it requires a moment to process properly. 2,694 men who went into the camp did not come out. Not as prisoners, not as liberated prisoners, they simply did not come out. When the soldiers of the 14th Army began advancing through Burma in 1944 and found liberated prisoners in the condition those men were in, men who had been fed starvation rations and worked to the edge of death and beaten for years, what exactly were they supposed to feel about the men who had done this? And what were they supposed to feel about the act of offering those men the formal protection of prisoner of war status? This is not a rhetorical question, it is a genuine one, and it does not have a clean answer. The 14th Army, commanded by General William Slim, arguably the finest British field commander of the entire war, a man who had been told by Churchill that he could not possibly be any good because of the name he happened to carry, and who went on to prove Churchill wrong in a way that the historical record has taken longer than it should to acknowledge properly, fought its way through Burma from 1943 through 1945 against an opponent that presented specific tactical problems unlike anything the European theatre had produced. The 14th Army was known as the Forgotten Army during the war, the name given to it by its own soldiers, not by anyone else, and continued to be somewhat forgotten afterward because its campaigns were conducted in a theatre where press coverage was thin, where the terrain was not photogenic in the way that Normandy or the North African desert were photogenic, and where the political complexities of the Indian Army's involvement made the story harder to package for a British domestic audience focused on a European war. By the time it had driven the Japanese out of Burma, in what the military historian John Keegan described as one of the outstanding achievements of the British Army in the whole of the Second World War, the attention of the British public and press was elsewhere. Japanese soldiers, as a matter of military culture, did not surrender. This was not universal. Some prisoners were taken, and those prisoners were interrogated, and that intelligence was valuable. But the expectation, on both sides, was that Japanese soldiers fought until they were dead or physically incapacitated. They did not raise their hands. They booby-trapped their own dead. They used wounded men as bait for ambushes. They used the formal signals of surrender as tactical deception in documented cases. Slim was direct about what this meant operationally. He wrote that taking Japanese prisoners was almost impossible, not because of a policy not to, but because of the behavior of the enemy himself. A man who will not surrender cannot be captured without being subdued, and subduing a man who is actively fighting to the death while also managing the tactical situation around you is, in practice, a different problem than accepting the surrender of a man who has decided to stop fighting. But there is a second layer to this that goes beyond the tactical problem Slim described, and it requires being said plainly. The soldiers of the 14th Army, British, Indian, Gurkha, African, knew what was happening to Allied prisoners in Japanese hands. They knew because they had been told. in briefings, and through regimental networks, and through the occasional liberated prisoner who was in a physical condition that made the testimony superfluous. They knew because the men who came out of the camps in the final stages of the war were walking evidence, literally, of what capture in this particular theatre meant. A soldier who knows that capture means a 27% chance of death through starvation, disease, and systematic brutality, who has seen what men look like after 3 years in a Japanese camp, makes a different calculation in combat than a soldier who expects that a prisoner will be clothed, fed, and treated in conformity with the Geneva Convention. This is not an endorsement, it is a description. The two things are different, and collapsing them together produces a history that doesn't match the actual experience of the men involved. The British Army's official position remained that prisoners should be taken when possible. Slim was consistent on this point, and the reasoning was clear-headed. Prisoners provided intelligence, and intelligence in the Burma campaign was often the difference between an ambush and a successful advance. The practical reality in the chaos of jungle warfare against an enemy whose own military culture treated surrender as the ultimate disgrace was considerably more complicated than any official position could capture. There is a distinction that military historians sometimes obscure, and it is worth making carefully here. British troops did not stop taking Japanese prisoners because of a formal order to that effect. No such order exists in the British military record. The official position of the British Army throughout the Burma campaign was that prisoners should be taken where possible and treated in accordance with international law. This is documented. It is also true. What is equally documented is that the rate at which Japanese prisoners were taken by British and Commonwealth forces was extremely low, far lower than the rate at which prisoners were taken on the European fronts. The reasons for this were multiple and interacting. Japanese soldiers genuinely fought to the death in the overwhelming majority of engagements. This is not contested. The Japanese military's own figures, compiled after the war, showed that Japan surrendered fewer soldiers as prisoners relative to total combat casualties than any other combatant nation on either side of either world war. The total number of Japanese prisoners taken by all Allied forces in the Pacific War is estimated at somewhere between 35 and 50,000, against Japanese military dead of approximately 1.7 million. The ratio speaks for itself. Allied soldiers fighting in Burma were not, in most engagements, being offered the opportunity to take prisoners because the men opposing them were not attempting to surrender. This tactical reality is separate from the question of what soldiers chose to do when surrender was possible, but it is an important context for that question, because a discussion of prisoner-taking that begins from the assumption that opportunities to take prisoners were routinely available fundamentally misrepresents the nature of the combat. When opportunities did arise, they were complicated by the tactical realities Slim described: the booby-trapping, the deceptive surrender, the ambush from apparent submission, which created a rational basis for caution on the part of soldiers who had learned, through experience, that a Japanese soldier raising his hands was not necessarily a soldier who had stopped fighting. And running alongside all of this was the knowledge, held by every man in the 14th Army who had been paying attention, of what British captivity under Japan looked like. 16,000 dead on the death railway, 6 survivors from Sandakan, men coming out of the camps in the final months of the war in states of physical deterioration that their liberators found difficult to look at. The calculation that some soldiers made, not all, not through official sanction, but some, reflected all of these factors simultaneously. It was not policy. It was the accumulated weight of what this particular war had made available to be known, pressing on the decisions of individual men in jungle clearings, in the heat, under fire, in the space between one moment and the next. Slim wrote about this with characteristic directness. He acknowledged that the nature of the enemy his men faced, the refusal to surrender, the use of deceptive surrender as a tactical tool, the booby-trapping, the behavior toward Allied prisoners, had produced attitudes in his soldiers that he understood, even when he could not officially sanction them. He was not a man who reached for comfortable formulations when uncomfortable ones were more accurate. His memoirs, Defeat into Victory, remain one of the most honest accounts of what it actually felt like to command men in this specific campaign, and the portrait he draws of the psychological texture of the Burma War is one that later, sanitized accounts of the conflict tend to flatten considerably. The 14th Army was also, it must be said, doing something that is frequently overlooked in accounts that focus on the prisoner question. It was winning. The battles of Kohima and Imphal in 1944 represented the largest defeat the Japanese army had suffered to that point in the war. The subsequent campaign that drove Japanese forces out of Burma was, by the end, a rout. The army that fought those battles, British, Indian, Gurkha, African, was one of the most diverse and in many respects most effective fighting formations in the entire British military record. What happened in the space between individual soldiers and individual enemies in the jungle is one part of that story. It is not the whole of it. After the Japanese surrender in August 1945, British authorities in Southeast Asia held approximately 113,000 Japanese prisoners. They were retained, some of them until 1947, for various post-war purposes, including the clearance of infrastructure and the administration of the immediate post-surrender period. They were, by all available accounts, treated in accordance with international law. This fact is not widely known and is worth dwelling on. The British Army, the same army whose soldiers had, in some documented cases, made individual decisions in the jungle that departed from official policy on prisoner treatment, handled the formal custody of over 100,000 Japanese prisoners according to the rules it had maintained throughout the war, even when those rules were not being reciprocated. The distinction between what individual soldiers sometimes did in combat and what the institution did with formal custody reflects something real about how armies work, and about how the pressures of specific circumstances in combat differ from the administered, deliberate conditions of formal captivity. That is a fact worth noting. The British Army, having fought a campaign against an enemy whose treatment of prisoners had no equivalent in the European theatre, emerged from that campaign and proceeded to treat its prisoners correctly. The soldiers who had made individual calculations in the jungle were part of the same institution that held those 113,000 men without systematic mistreatment. War crimes trials were conducted. Japanese officers responsible for the death railway, for Sandakan, for the Hell ships, for the Selarang Incident, and dozens of other documented episodes were tried, convicted, and in some cases, executed. The legal record of what had happened was established at some length in official proceedings. The Japanese government, for reasons that remain a live source of tension between Japan and its former adversaries, has never made a formal, comprehensive apology for the treatment of Allied prisoners of war comparable to Germany's post-war engagement with its own history. Individual Japanese prime ministers have expressed regret on various occasions. The specific institutional acknowledgement of responsibility for what happened on the death railway, at Sandakan, on the Hell ships, the kind of acknowledgement that would close the gap between the historical record and the official national memory, has not arrived. The Far East prisoners of war community in Britain, which maintained its identity and its advocacy for decades after the war, documented this absence carefully and felt it acutely. Their organizations have now largely ceased to exist because the men who formed them are gone. The last FEPOWs were dying into the early years of this century, in their 80s and 90s, still carrying physical and psychological damage from events that had occurred more than 60 years before they died. Their children and grandchildren, in many cases, knew almost nothing of what had happened. The silence was that complete. The British Legion's Far East Prisoner of War Committee, which had maintained the community and the advocacy for decades, formally wound down as its membership became too small and too elderly to sustain it. The history they carried went with them, in most cases, without being properly recorded. Some of them had spent decades waiting for an acknowledgement that never quite came in the form they needed. Some had made their peace with that in their own way. Some had not. The men who survived the camps returned to Britain and largely did not speak about what had happened to them. Some because they had been advised not to. Returning veterans of the 14th Army were sometimes explicitly told that Britain wanted to look forward and that there was not much appetite for the specific story of what had happened in Burma and Singapore. Some because they did not have the words. Some because the words they had for it did not seem to belong to any conversation that was actually taking place in post-war Britain, where the war was being processed through different images, different theatres, different experiences. The dog tags in the drawer. The question that was never quite asked. The 23-year-old who was dead from beriberi by October 1942, 8 months after his capture. His story is not the most extreme in this account. There are worse ones, with specific names attached, in the war crimes trial records at Labuan and in Tokyo, in the testimony collected by the war crimes investigation teams that went through Southeast Asia in the months after the Japanese surrender. But it is the story that stays with me, the gap between the weight of the tin tags and the complete inadequacy of the official cause of death stamped on a Japanese camp record. Because it is the story that connects the abstraction of military policy and prisoner conventions and the legal frameworks of the laws of war to the particular, irreversible reality of what this war was for the men who fought it and the men who didn't come home from it. The tags came home. They do not explain anything. They simply prove that he existed. If you stay to the end of this, write FEPOW in the comments. That is the word the veterans used for themselves, Far East Prisoners of War. It was not an official designation so much as a community, a way of naming a shared experience that nobody outside it fully understood, and that those inside it were often not able to explain to those outside it even when they tried. Most of them are gone now, and the ones who weren't talking talked less as they got older. Write it if you made it here. It is the only way I know how many of us spent this time with them.